Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Method Ministries. And today we're joined with Harold Eberle. Did I say your name right? Your
Yes,
last
you
name?
did.
Perfect.
Great.
So Harold is an author, and I got him here to talk about his awesome book that I just read a couple weeks back, Victorious Eschatology. Now, I also, I should mention that you co-authored this with Dr.
Yes.
Martin Trench.
Yes. Martin, he pastors a church in Canada, but I met him when he was pastoring in Scotland. So we've been friends for over 30 years.
Okay, and I wanted to get you on because you're a premillennialist, but you're using words like victorious, what is it? Victorious eschatology, optimism, and you're also
Yes.
a partial preterist. So, I'm really interested in learning, all about your eschatology because I'm a premillennialist. I'm just not
Yes.
a partial preterist. So, but that's fine. I'm here again,
Yep.
like to learn. I'm all about you. I read your book and I have some questions too. So as we go along, I'll be picking your brain.
Great. And the biggest distinction, though, is most premillennialists are dispensational.
Yeah.
Dispensationalism logically leads to a premillennial view, but I'm not a dispensationalist.
Me
So I
too.
have
I'm not a
arrived.
dispensationalist.
Okay, I've arrived at premillennialism independently of dispensationalism.
Great. Okay. Awesome. Do you want to give a quick intro for our audience for who you are and what you do?
Sure. So my wife and I live in Washington State, middle of the state, little city called Yakima. We pastored a church for 6 years, but we left that ministry 39 years ago. We've been traveling last 39 years, about a third of our energies in other countries. My wife was a school teacher for 15 years, but all the rest of the time she's traveled with me. Now we're focusing on the Middle East. We've been a lot among the Muslim parts of the world for the last 12 years. Pakistan and Indonesia are our biggest countries. So we have five Bible schools in Pakistan. We've got before that we worked in Africa, middle of the continent for 17 years. So when we're here in the States, we travel and minister in churches of all different denominations.
Great.
Anything
Awesome. Thank
else?
you for
Yep.
that. Yeah. No, that was it. Oh, is there a Facebook page to follow you on, or anything else?
Yeah, our ministry is called WorldCast Ministries. One word, WorldCast. So website or Facebook. Yep, anyone can go there.
Great. Okay. Awesome. All right. Well, let's start from the beginning. So, again, the book is named Victorious Eschatology. So, what makes your eschatology victorious?
So behind every eschatology, there is a framework for studying the Bible that people already have. Like there's a dispensational framework that I don't embrace. There's also a covenantal framework. And the covenantal theology is the most common framework used to interpret the Bible. Most people don't know that they have a framework through which they're reading the Bible. Um, and my framework, I understand that it is God working out his plan throughout the ages. I would look at Ephesians chapter 1, where Paul explains that before the foundation of the world, God chose that he wanted children who are holy and blameless, and he chose to accomplish this through Jesus Christ. So Paul explains that in chapter 1. And so his end goal is in mind. God wants in the end to have children who are holy and blameless. He's going to accomplish this through Jesus. And then it says, and he does all things after the counsel of his will, meaning every act of God throughout history, he is keeping in mind, he's considering the outcome, and he's moving the world closer to that outcome. His goal is to be a father who has holy and blameless children. So that's not a covenantal framework or a dispensational. It is simply seeing a confident God work out his will, and he will continue to do so until he succeeds at his end goal. That
Okay.
worldview, that framework, to me, is the meta narrative of the whole Bible.
And you call that kingdom eschatology, correct?
Yes,
In,
we
in
do.
the book.
Yes. So one of the big differences is dispensationalism does not believe God's kingdom is available today, but it will come to earth when Jesus returns. Then he'll set up his kingdom on earth. Whereas I see a progressive buildup of everything God is doing. That 2,000 years ago, when Jesus ascended into heaven, His kingdom was established, but now it's growing in the earth. And I would point to most of the parables that Jesus says start with the kingdom of God is like this. It's like seeds growing in the soil. So it's like yeast growing into dough. It's like the smallest of all seeds. So I see a kingdom growing, and it will continue to grow till it fills the earth. So that makes a progressive advancement of God's will. Kingdom theology, meaning kingdom is here and it's available and it's growing. So, like Daniel chapter 2, he interprets a dream of a kingdom starting when Jesus came 2,000 years ago and continuing to grow until it fills the earth. So that means anyone who embraces that has to have an optimistic view that the kingdom is growing, it's expanding.
Okay, and what's the history of this kingdom eschatology? Is it more modern, or does it reach back a little, further back?
So I would even look back to historic premillennialism. Um, that's usually associated with the first 2 and 3 centuries of Christianity. But then it disappeared into covenantal theology, being the dominant theology, starting with
Yeah.
Augustine. But historic premillennialism, my understanding, it was the dominant view for the first 3 centuries of Christianity. I'm
Yeah.
leaning that way. I've embraced it. So I see the kingdom growing, growing, growing. Jesus will return and fully establish his kingdom, obliterate all evil when he comes back. But the kingdom is growing right now up until that day.
Okay. And when people hear that, they might think, "Oh, well, you're a post mill," but you're not a post mill. You're a pre-mill. But
Yes.
just to clarify, when you say like it's growing, do you believe like there will be this, I guess, lack of a better word, a post mill vision where the world will be like Christianized and the gospel will have success and nations will be converted?
Yes. So, yeah, sometimes people confuse the views, but I would share the same progressive advancement as a post mill. I'm not so sure it's going to arrive at such a good state before Jesus returns. I believe it will take the return of Jesus Christ to actually obliterate evil. So, yes, it will get better and better, but I have no conviction at how good it's going to be before Jesus returns. I just see it getting better until that point, and it will require the return of Jesus Christ to fully manifest.
Okay, gotcha. Is the author, is he a covenantalist, or is he dispensation? Well, probably not a dispensationalist. He's
Yes,
probably a covenantalist.
he's more covenantal. Yes, that's his
Gotcha.
background. Yeah. So he lets me take the dominant role in writing the book, where
Yeah, noted.
his notes are in there, which also put in the covenantal side.
Okay. Do you guys ever like get down to the nitty gritty and like kind of disagree, on the
Yeah,
post mill premium
we
side?
do. We do. So, he would definitely agree with that. Everything's getting better and better and better. Um, And so we've argued a few times, but we're good friends. We've been for a long time.
Right.
Some people you can argue with and be very good friends with. In fact, that is your relationship in some places. It's the funnest part of your relationship.
Yeah, and I like that about your book too, that you were both, different eschatologies, background, but you can still, write a book like that, which is great because too often people, will go crazy about these differences and then just results in division. You can't be friends with each other. So,
Yes.
I do appreciate that ecumenical spirit.
Yeah. But I find it in different parts of the world how much is acceptable or not. Um, like in Europe, Western Europe anyway, that's a good thing to be able to have dialogues. In North America, it is. But whenever I spend a lot of my time in third world countries, they're much more hierarchical in structure. And they have a very difficult time reading books where there's more than one opinion.
Hmm.
They want to know this is truth, this is what we will teach, don't confuse us. Um, but that's a characteristic of hierarchical societies wherein we have progressively over the last 80 years become less patriarchal, less hierarchical, and so we appreciate more dialogue back and forth. But over half the earth is not that way today. Over half the earth is still very much wanting one opinion, um, but not North America. We've moved in the other direction.
Hmm. Now, what makes you different from a dispensationalist? We'll get to the, because I want to go into the Olivet Discourse soon too, because that's a big one. But
Sure.
as far as like a hermeneutic, framework goes, what do you disagree with dispensationalism?
So, just so everyone knows, it's a way of thinking that divides all of history and all of time into dispensations. Usually they divide into seven dispensations, but they are seen a dispensation as a period of time during which God acted with humanity, related to humanity in a specific manner. Like when Adam was created, that's the start of dispensation. God dealt with Adam and Eve in a specific way. After they sinned, God changed his manner of relating to humanity. That continued up to Noah's flood. Then Noah's flood to Abraham is another dispensation. Then Abraham to when most of the Jews rejected Jesus. That's usually considered the dispensation of Jews. But the key being God has changed how he relates to humanity in each dispensation. I reject that because I have understanding that God has one goal that links all of history together. Dispensationalism doesn't tie the dispensations. There's no link showing that God acts
Mm,
consistently throughout those dispensations. God's very different and acts very different during each dispensation. And I think that's a wrong way to look at the nature of God, the workings of God. It actually, in each dispensation, God has a plan, but the plan fails because humans fail. So God establishes a new type of plan where I see, God's progressively advancing his will and he never fails. None of his plans ever fail. He has one overarching plan that will be fulfilled and he is succeeding. He'll never fail. Where dispensationalism sees God repeatedly failing and then enacting a new plan. That to me is contrary to the nature of God um, and to the nature of his one plan for the ages.
gotcha. So so to reiterate, you see the kingdom of God ever growing, and his rule is ever extending.
Yeah, I'd have to qualify it though, because I see the kingdom got established when Jesus resurrected and ascended to heaven.
Got it.
Preceding that, it was prophesied, spoken repeatedly through prophets. So I wouldn't say it really started back in Genesis. I would say it started when Jesus ascended into heaven, and it's been
Okay.
growing since then.
Just one more question on dispensationalism. Do you then see the church in Israel as one, or do you keep them distinct?
So that's a real important point. And most people only know dispensational thinking or covenantal thinking.
Mm,
Even those people don't know that they're covenantal or dispensational. It's just the
yeah.
way they've been trained. Well, dispensationalism leads to one view of the Jews. Covenantal thinking leads to a different conclusion about the Jews. Dispensationalism, they have a dispensation of Jews from Abraham to when most rejected Jesus. But they also say that God has not fulfilled all of his promises to the Jews. Therefore, the Jews need another dispensation in the future. After the church dispensation, which we're presently in, they see church dispensation will end when Jesus returns. But then God still has to have a time to fulfill his promises. And they will put them both in a 7-year tribulation, but also during a 1,000-year millennial reign. That means the Jews are still God's covenant people. They've been set on hold while God's dealing with the church, but God's just going to bring them back into the spotlight. So that is often referred to as Zionism. Zionism meaning that the Jews will be elevated up to a position of authority in the
Mm,
earth. As a nation, they will be elevated by God to a place of prominence and governance in the earth. At the opposite of Zionism is replacement theology. But that's what we come to logically if we start with covenant theology. Covenant theology, which is the dominant view of mainline Christianity, historic Christianity, has been a contrast between what God did with Adam and what God did with Jesus Christ. That God made a covenant with Adam, a covenant of works. And I know you know all this, I'm saying it for everybody
yeah.
else.
Yeah, that's fine.
And God made a covenant with Jesus Christ. So there's a contrast between the covenant of works and covenant of grace. Well, with Augustine and Luther and Calvin, all three of them believe that anyone who has faith in God gets the advantages of the covenant of grace through Jesus Christ. So even the Old Testament people, like Abraham and all the Jews who believed in God, they are actually the same covenant people as the new covenant people because they get to be partakers of the new covenant. That means covenant people only recognize one covenant people. All the believers in the Old Testament are part of the new covenant made through Jesus, and everyone since Jesus who believes in Jesus are part of that one covenant people. So, since there's only one covenant people with covenant theology, the Jews are not a separate covenant people. And in fact, covenant theology separates the terminology Jews from Israel. And we'll say the Jews are the natural descendants and Israel are the spiritual descendants, and that the natural descendants actually never were God's covenant people. Natural descendants, only if they believe in God do they become Israel, do they become part of the new covenant. So it ends up, the ultimate conclusion of that is that the church has replaced the Jews. So that's why there's this big disagreement between dispensationalism and covenant theology about the Jews.
Hmm.
So Zionism versus replacement, I don't believe either of those views. I believe that God is progressively working out his will, confidently working out his will. So I look at, yes, they were covenant people in the Old Testament, the Jews, the natural descendants of Abraham, but they were cut off from the ongoing work of God, fulfilling out his will for a time. Yes, when most of them rejected Jesus, they were severed from the ongoing of God's will being fulfilled. But there's a promise that they will be grafted back in before the return of Jesus. So I understand Romans chapter 11 as a promise. Paul was saying that God will open their eyes, that he hardened them for a time, but they're going to have their eyes opened up. They won't be, that doesn't mean they'll be forced to receive Jesus, but they'll be able to understand Jesus the Messiah. They'll be grafted back in, and therefore the Jews and Gentiles together will continue along in God's unfolding plan. So I am looking and believing that there will be an awakening among the Jews. They'll be grafted back into God's unfolding plan, and Jews and Gentiles together. So I like the terminology one new man, not Zionism, not replacement theology, but one new man, meaning Jews and Gentiles grafted together
Got
before
it.
the end.
You
So
and I
that,
agree on that. Yeah,
okay.
on Romans 11, because a lot of Christians, get a little testy when it comes down to Romans chapter 11, and you find a lot
Yes,
of
they do.
disagreement real fast.
Yes,
And you
they
found it
do.
recently too with like the war with was it Hamas going on
Yes.
recently?
Yeah.
Some sparks flew.
It's really serious right now. And it's a lot based on dispensational or covenant theology. Those are the only two options most Christians know about, one or the other.
Well, it's funny too because when you talk about this and you quote Romans 11, you get accused of being a dispensationalist, and I
Yeah.
always have to tell people I'm not a dispensationalist, and I even try to show them like John Wesley, Charles
Yes.
Spurgeon, J.C. Ryle, they believed in the future conversion of the
Yes.
Jews based upon Romans 11, and actually
Yes.
this was even the classic post mill position, which is
Yes.
ironic because
It
today's
is.
post mill doesn't want to wants to hold to replacement theology, doesn't want to even, go anything near that because it's too dispensational to them. But it's like, well, I don't care about that. I just care about the scriptures, and this is what it's saying.
Yes. And if you talk about any kind of redemption of the Jews, you are accused of being dispensationalist
Yeah.
because they've never heard another explanation.
Yeah, they haven't.
So
So,
you immediately have to start defending yourself.
yeah, you do. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about the preterism part because you're
Yes.
a partial preterist. If you want to just
Yep.
explain that for our audience and then go into your views.
So making people comfortable with terminology first, so they're not scared off.
Yep.
Um, Futurist is the opposite of preterist. Futurist means the prophecies in the Bible about the end times, usually talking about the book of Revelations, Matthew 24, Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 9, those end time prophecies. If you're a futurist, you believe all those will be fulfilled in our future. Sometime in the future, you're looking for the book of Revelation to be fulfilled. The opposite is a preterist. That means those prophecies, the book of Revelations, have been fulfilled in the past. Now, some Christians who've never heard that position before, um, it just surprises them because they've only been taught dispensational, which is futures. Dispensationalism leads you to a futurist position, that the book of Revelation is in the future, where covenant theology can lead you to a couple different ways. But we're just getting the words comfortable: futurist, preterist. I'm a partial preterist. That's in between. That means part of the book of Revelations will be fulfilled in the future, and part of it was fulfilled in the past. Now, I would propose that this has been the historic church's view, that up until dispensationalism started, most of historic Christianity has believed part of the book of Revelation was fulfilled in the past, part of it in the future. I would look at the events that happened in 70 AD when Jerusalem was destroyed as the time when some prophecies were fulfilled. So some of the book of Revelations was fulfilled. And in the book, I detail exactly how much of Revelations, chapters 7 to 11, I believe were the judgment of the Jewish religious leaders in Jerusalem. But then the Roman Empire gets judged. And then in the future, the Revelation still has many judgments for the future. So I'm a partial preterist, which means I'm not futurist. I'm not preterist. I'm in between, saying some have been fulfilled, some will be fulfilled.
So, and I guess like contrasting it more with dispensationalism, you also don't believe, as a partial preterist, that the tribulation is, or the great tribulation is future. You believe that's been fulfilled, and I guess you would tie that into part of the being the victorious part, right? Because the worst is
Yes.
behind us, so to speak. If
Yes.
that's fair.
Yes. So I would put that's probably the biggest difference between dispensationalism. If you read the Bible through dispensational framework, you will conclude that there's a future 7-year period. And that tribulation, it's called the tribulation, is when most of the book of Revelations gets fulfilled during 7 years. I understand that, and I believe I'm agreeing with the historic church. Most Christians have believed before dispensationalism came around that much of the tribulation happened in 70 AD and it was directed toward the Jews. Now, we still believe there's going to be difficult times ahead. We still believe people are suffering today. There's always going to be difficulties until Jesus returns. However, we would show that, like Matthew 24, some of that judgment Jesus was talking about was fulfilled in 70 AD. I believe that, but I still am looking for a progressive advancement. And so, yes, tribulation has already happened. That makes me victorious, but that's not the number one reason I'm victorious. Number one reason victorious is because I believe a progressive advancement of the kingdom, that a child was born to us, a son will be given to us, and there'll be no end to the increase of his government. That's the kingdom will grow and grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. So my number one reason for being victorious is the advancing kingdom. Number two is the tribulation's already happened.
Can you? Yeah. So some people might hear that and think, like you're crazy. You're a
Yes.
heretic. I don't
Yeah,
think that, but I know people out there, get triggered by these things.
we do.
So, when you say that Matthew 24 has been fulfilled, what's the argument that you give for that? And also, too, myself, just to clarify, what portion of Matthew 24 do you believe has been fulfilled? I'll grab my Bible too.
Okay, I'll grab mine too.
You don't have
I'm
to go
glad
through everything, but as an overview.
I'm glad you're asking because it's actually just what you say. There's people out there going, "What? What is he
Yeah.
saying?" Because they've been taught all their life about a future tribulation. Now, I
Yeah.
was raised with that view, dispensationalism. Um, I used to teach dispensationalism with its corresponding view that there's going to be a 7-year tribulation, then a millennial reign. So I'm teaching something, explaining something that I used to believe, but I can explain why I changed.
Interesting.
Um, but there are many listeners out there. In fact, I think it's worth saying that dispensationalism has dominated the public Christian television and radio for the last 80 years, since the 1960s. So dispensational thinking, which with its tribulation, future tribulation, has had the dominant public place And most of the Christians listening right now who will listen to this happen to be raised during that period of their lives, so they don't know anything else. They
Yeah.
don't know that dispensationalism is a recently developed way of thinking. And if you go before 100 years earlier, go back in time, that for most of church history, for 1,800 plus years, the church had a different view. The church had a view like Matthew 24, part of it was already fulfilled. And so that's what we're looking at right now. And for me, I have to go to verse 3 in Matthew
Mhm.
24. This is when Jesus is sitting on the Mount of Olives. This is the very week where Jesus had his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. They put palm branches down. They welcomed in the king. The masses of Jerusalem showed up to welcome him. This is the last week of his life. Here it was probably halfway through the week, probably Tuesday. He's sitting on the side of the mountain looking at Jerusalem. And now the disciples ask him these questions. Verse 3, Matthew 24:3. He was sitting in the Mount of Olives. Disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So dispensationalists, they hear that. And what they heard this question asking is, when will the end of the world be? And part of the reason is because the King James Version, the last question is, what about the end of the world? Well, the first thing that people like me point out is there's not one question. It's not just one question about the end of the world. There's three questions. And Jesus is going to answer all three questions one at a time. If we put them all together, we're going to get confused. If we put them all together like dispensationalists, we will tend to think all three questions are about the end of the world. But reality, looking at it again, they asked him, when will these things happen? That's question number one. What will be the sign of your coming? That's question number two. And what about the end of the age or the end of the world? Question number three. So, in order to really understand this, we have to answer each question independently. Question number one is most important. When will these things happen? Instead of jumping to the conclusion that this is about the end of the world, we need to decide, what were the disciples asking Jesus? This was 2,000 years ago, sitting on the Mount of Olives. Well, to understand that, we have to read the context. And if we let our eyes go back and we read Matthew 23, of course, I know you know this, we're explaining it to everybody
Yeah,
else.
absolutely.
Of course, Matthew 23, the entire chapter is when Jesus was in the temple in Jerusalem. First 13 verses, he talks to the disciples and warns them about the Jewish religious leaders. Then beginning in verse 13, he points at the Jewish religious leaders in the temple and starts judging them. Like verse 13, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. Verse 14, woe to you, scribes. 15, woe to you, scribes. He goes down and calls them hypocrites, a brood of vipers. And you read this chapter, it's just the most stunning rebuke that Jesus gives anywhere in the Bible. Maybe we could see some in the book of Revelations, but this is catastrophic things he says. For example, verse 33, you serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell? He's saying this to the Jewish religious leaders. Then he explains that judgment will come upon this generation, you Jews. So 2,000 years ago, this event happened. Verse 37, then he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stone those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. So when he says the house there, I understand he's saying this temple, this house will be desolate. Then that is the last verse of chapter 23. We have to read right into chapter 24, which is the very next verse. There's no break in the original Bible. So Matthew 24, verse 1, Jesus came out from the temple, was going away when the disciples came up and pointed out the temple buildings to him. So it's all one event, rebuking the scribes and Pharisees, saying this temple will be destroyed, judgment will come. They walk out of the temple, and the disciples still pointing back at that building. Jesus says in verse 2, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will not be left upon another, which will not be torn down. He has just said every stone of that temple will be destroyed. That brings us to our key verse. They're sitting in the Mount of Olives, verse 3. And when they said, when will these things happen? People like me, we believe they weren't asking about the end of the world with the first question. First question is, when will that temple be destroyed? Now that changes everything, because it's one thing to ask, when will that temple be destroyed? But the third question, when the end of the world, that's a separate question. So when will that temple be destroyed? We know historically that in 70 AD, 20,000 Roman soldiers surrounded the city,
Mm,
sealed the city off, starved the people in Jerusalem, almost 1 million people. Some of the statistics of that time, whether you're reading Josephus or some of the other historians, say there were up to 3 million. But anyway, at least 1 million people starved to death. And the soldiers first practiced that anyone trying to escape, the Jews escaping, they had a practice of cutting open their stomachs, looking for gems, because they knew Jews often would try to escape carrying gems in their stomach. But they
mm,
would cut open their stomachs and send them back into the city. That went on for months. Then the people starving to death, the general ordered no longer cut their stomachs open, cut their hands off and send them back into the city. That went on for several months. Finally, after starving, they now descended upon the city. They murdered more than 1 million Jews, 2,000 gathered in the temple. They slit the throats of all 2,000 plus people gathered in there. Then they lit the temple on fire, and the fire melted the gold in the dome into the rocks. Because the gold was melted, a later general ordered that every rock be removed one at a time and the gold scraped away. Exactly as Jesus said, not one stone will be left upon another. That happened in 70 AD. Jesus prophesied it, and most of the historic church has believed that that was Jesus' first question, that the question that they first asked was, when will the temple be destroyed? Now, we still believe that they ask about the end of the world, but we see that as the third question, not the first question. So
w-
that
uh,
changes. Go ahead.
I was going to ask you, would you then interpret the end of the age as the Jewish age, or would you interpret that as the end of the world?
So uh, there are some partial preterists that see it as the end of the Jewish age. I don't,
Okay.
because I don't believe the disciples believed it was near the Jewish age. I don't think that any concept of a Jewish age ending. Their
I agree.
mindset at that time was that the kingdom was for the Jews. In fact, like in Acts chapter 1, verse where they say, is this the time you're going to restore the kingdom to Jerusalem and the Jews? The disciples still believe there is no Jewish age ending. They were believing, no, the kingdom will be restored to the Jews. That was still their mindset.
Okay.
So I can't believe that that's referring to the Jewish age. I have to believe it's the end of the world, which does determine how I interpret the rest of Matthew 24, because I see he answers question number 1, then question number 2, then question number 3.
Yeah, like I actually agree. Agree with you too. John Wesley actually was the most similar to you. Do you
Oh,
do
yeah.
you interpret? I'm gonna remember. I think you interpret verses 1 through 35 as 80, 70.
Yes, I do.
Okay,
Yes. And that's, to me, question number 1 and question number 2 are in there. That those were fulfilled 80, 70. But then starting verse 36 to the end of Matthew 24 and all of Matthew 25, I believe are answering, when's the end of the world?
got it.
Biggest
Okay,
biggest issue that Jesus says, he gives 7 parables, and the main point being it's a surprise. No one will know. That when the end of the world comes, there'll be no warning, no signs. Jesus Christ, boom, he's going to return.
okay, got it. Yeah, because I think just for the audience, verse 36 is, but of that day and hour, so you can kind of see this switch over, but of
Yeah,
that day. So now he again he answered the first two questions.
yeah,
Now he's going to the third, but of that day and hour. And John Wesley
yes,
took that too.
yeah.
Um,
So did
and
Spurgeon.
then oh, Spurgeon did as well. Okay.
Yes. Hmm.
And now, so the coming, because I know growing up again in that dispensational culture,
Yeah.
coming. is always interpreted as the second coming, where,
Yes.
we don't know this, that in the Bible, actually, comings doesn't just mean a second parousia, a second physical coming. It means in judgment, like God is going to come and do something. And even, it's
Yes.
ironic too, because, even like in evangelical churches, like we'll pray that God would come and move in us. We're not
Yes.
praying for a second coming. We're just praying for God would come and do something.
Yes.
So, I guess,
I'm.
verse
Yep.
30, the Son of Man will come, you would interpret that as, if you want to explain it, but Daniel 7 language.
So, um, so everyone knows we're dealing with the three questions. The first question we said is about the destruction of Jerusalem. The third question is about the end of the world. But the second question is, and what will be the sign of your coming? So everybody knows we're talking about that second question. Most partial preterists take that coming to be Jesus coming in judgment. Okay. I don't and understand it that way. I can understand how they see that obviously when the disciples were sitting on the side of the mountain 2,000 years ago and turned to Jesus and said, "What about your coming?" They were not asking about the second coming. They didn't know there was going to be a second coming.
Mm.
Just two chapters earlier and three chapters earlier, Jesus was trying to explain to them that he was going to die, and they couldn't even believe that. They weren't even going to believe he was going to die. So they couldn't have been asking about a second coming yet. They had no consciousness that there was going to be a second coming. So, setting aside the second coming, there's still a debate among partial preterists. Is the coming, Jesus coming in judgment? I don't no longer believe that one. I believe, no, the coming is when a king comes into his kingdom. When will your coming be? So back in Matthew 16, the last verse 28, truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom.
Mm.
So Jesus was saying, some of you who are alive here, you will still be alive when I come into my kingdom. I think the terminology is what every Jew knew, that the Son of Man would come up to the Ancient of Days and be given all authority over heaven and earth. They were looking for Messiah. When will you come? I compare it to, this was probably Tuesday of Holy Week. On Sunday was the Passover, probably the triumphal entry on just 2 days earlier, when they were thinking, this is the king. He is the king that's going to set up the Jewish kingdom that they were looking for. Even the thief that died on the cross next to Jesus said, remember me when you come into your kingdom. That was common terminology, when you come into your kingdom. So
Hmm.
I believe the first kingdom, first question, what about the Jerusalem destruction? Second question, when will you come into your kingdom? Third question, what about the end of the world? So there's a little, different emphasis in different partial preterists, but that's how I understand the three questions.
Okay, I like that explanation, because like you differ slightly with like the Kenneth Gentry's,
Yes.
post mill, the Doug Wilson post mills.
Yes.
I like how you still like hold that the end of an age does mean the end of the world, because I know some will use that argument again, like Gary DeMar, and I think that's a
Yes.
weak argument to use.
I do too.
Like it doesn't work contextually, and like you run into problems like, well, it's like, well, why aren't you a hyper preterist then?
Right. It is exactly. I have every one of those thoughts that you have. I think those disciples had no concept of an end of a Jewish age. That was far from their thinking. They still thought the kingdom was a Jewish kingdom that Jesus was going to set up.
I guess, you know what? I do want to ask you though. This came to my mind now though, but because I know Gary DeMar is famous for quoting 1 Corinthians 10:11, where Paul talks about how the end of the ages has come upon us, and he'll say, "Look, that was the Jewish age." Do you believe the end of the age there was the end of the world? Paul was talking about.
Still not the end of the Jewish age. He's inserting that word. I mean, obviously, when it says the end of the age, doesn't say the Jewish. That's an entirely decision that he is making to insert that concept. However, end of an aeon, end of an age. There are several different ages referred to in Scripture. I have to put that there was an age of under the old covenant. There was a old covenantal age. That's different to me than Jewish age. There was a switch when Jesus established the new covenant that the old covenant passed. But I do not see that the Jews were discarded, Because as soon as you see end of the Jewish age, you are taking on an attitude toward the Jews that it's over for them. You cannot not go down that path. You now have to interpret the book of Revelation as these judgments are against the Jews, and like Damar and those leaders, they do look at almost all of Revelations as against the Jews. Jewish age isn't in there. Yes, it's an age, but I believe it's an age in which we were under the old covenant, and now we're in a new covenant. So just
Gotcha.
use age, don't insert the word Jewish.
Do you believe then Paul was talking about in 1 Corinthians 10? What age was Paul talking about then? Just to clarify.
So Paul also talks about this evil age that he was presently living in. So that word age doesn't have to be just applied to one period of time. It can be just a period of time. So I am seeing the transition being old covenant, new covenant. It's the end of the old covenant age. That's the Mosaic laws. Now we're under an age of grace. But we have to leave out the word Jew because it's not in there. We have to look at the laws and grace.
Gotcha. Okay. And you know, again, forgive me if I'm being redundant, but you don't believe that the end of the age in Matthew 24 is the Jewish age, is the end of the world, because in their mind they didn't know
Yes.
that distinction. Okay. Gotcha.
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to
Yep.
clarify that.
Yep. So I see the end of the world is the third question. When will the
Okay.
end of the world be?
And I also did like how you explained the abomination of desolation, which was different because you explained that as the Roman army. So like the Jews
Yes.
would see that as an abomination rather than the guy, the Romans coming in the temple or the Antichrist coming in the temple and saying, I'm God.
Yes. So I point out in the book how this dialogue that Jesus had with the disciples is recorded in Matthew 24 and also in Luke 21. So here in Matthew 24, it's verse 15, which says, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken through Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place." That sentence is also recorded by Luke, but Luke uses slightly different terminology. So I'm saying, look at Luke. How did Luke describe that same verbiage? What verbiage did he use for that? And he said, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize her desolation is near.
Hmm.
So there's the word desolation, but then the following verses say, get out of town, run, don't get your coat, don't go down into your houses, run. Well, in Matthew, it's the abomination of desolation, get out of town, run, don't get your coats, don't go back in town. So that when you see this abomination, Luke refers to it when you see the army surrounding Jerusalem. I put the two together. Matthew and Luke are talking about the same event. So the abomination of desolation to me has to be when you see those armies surrounding, that's abominable to Jews, Gentile people circling the holy city. That was just an abomination to them.
Got it. Okay. So, now I know this ties into, this is kind of like a preface for the book of Revelation.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. And that's like really what like I'm interested more to learn about too from you.
Yeah.
So how do you then interpret or bring this in, if that's the right word to use, to the book of Revelation?
So Revelations chapter 1, we know, is Jesus meets John. Chapters 2 and 3 are 7 letters to 7 churches. So we're really talking about chapter 4 to chapter 19. Those are the judgments. That's the big question. But there's 3 sets of judgments between chapter 4 and chapter 19. So we're just deciding, when do those 3 sets of judgments fit? Now, I see first chapter 4, John's taken to heaven. He gets to see the throne room of God. But then there's a book and seals are going to be broken. When the 7th seal is broken, that's when the first set of judgments fall. But before that last seal is broken, before the judgments fall, chapter 7 of Revelations, God seals 144,000 Jews. I understand he's sealing them to protect them because this judgment was against Jews. He wanted to spare remnant, make sure that not all the Jews get destroyed, seal 144,000 of them. Then, right after he seals them, he opens the last seal, judgment falls. I see that as the first set of judgments going chapters 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. And chapter 11 to me makes it most clear because he talks in verse 1. Then there was given me a measuring rod like a staff, and someone said, get up and measure the temple of God. Okay, that means the temple was still standing, but at the end of this chapter, the temple is destroyed. He refers to this city, verse 8, and their deeds and bodies will lay in the streets of the great city, which mystically is called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. Okay, the city where the Lord was crucified was Jerusalem. So people like me find a lot of other references in chapters 7 through 11 that refer to the Jews, but those are key ones to us, saying, no, this first set of judgment, God sealed 144,000 Jews, then he started judgment. The temple was there, then the temple got destroyed. First set of judgments against the Jews, but then starting chapter 12, he's talking about the Roman Empire. Now there's disagreements among partial preterists about the second set of judgments. Some leaders like DeMar would say the second set is also against the Jews. I believe the second set are against Rome and the Roman Empire. I don't know that we're going to settle the argument right here. I'm just telling you where I'm at. The second set to me is against the Roman Empire. And then after the Roman Empire, the rest of the judgments are the rest of the world. So Jesus was told by the Father, once you sit on the throne, sit here, son, until I make every enemy a footstool for your feet. So I see that's what the book of Revelations is about. Jesus sat on his throne 2,000 years ago. The Father begins judgment, and he's making everything bow. First the Jewish enemies, then the Roman Empire, then the rest of the evil people in the world. Finally, in chapter 19, Jesus returns victorious to rule the nations with a rod of iron. So I see it's a progressive set of judgments against the enemies of Jesus Christ so that the Father can send the Son in chapter 19 and then rule for 1,000 years.
Gotcha. A lot to cover. Probably take us like 5 hours to go. Into
Yes,
into everything. The first thing I have is chapter 6. The four horsemen. Do you see?
Yes.
Because you mentioned 7 through 11. Do you see that as AD 70 as well?
But I see it in a specific way. Most dispensationalists, when they see these four horses, they think that when a horse is mentioned, it's being sent to the earth with judgment.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it's not that at all. For example, chapter 6, verse 1, then I saw the Lamb broke one of the seven seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures say, as with a voice of thunder, come. And I looked, and behold, a white horse. Each of these horses come. They don't go, they come. So, and we're told that about each of these four horses. They're not going to earth to bring destruction. At this stage, they're simply coming up to the throne room and presenting themselves to God. These is like back in those times in history before war, the captains of the armies would present themselves. So this was simply the presentation of all the warfare of God, but the war doesn't start until the last seal is broken in chapter 8.
Interesting. I never heard that view before.
So it's like you have you align the front line of battle before the war is going to begin. This is simply come, align. And the seventh seal doesn't get broken until chapter 8. Then the trumpets blow. First trumpet blows, usually back at that time, the arrows were shot. Second trumpet blows, the cavalry goes. Third trumpet goes, the army starts marching. Each trumpet blow is another one of that wall of the battlefront beginning. So first they come. And in fact, we know the battle doesn't come because right after all four horses they come and stand before God. Then verse 9 of chapter 6, The Lamb broke the fifth seal, and I saw underneath the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and because of their testimony which they had maintained. And they cried out with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, will you refrain from judging and avenging our blood on those who dwell on the earth? So soon as they present, they know what's going to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. They said, How long till the battle starts? All of them are crying out because the battle didn't start when the horses came. They just presented this battlefront in order that it was getting ready for battle. And now, when the seventh seal is broken, the first trumpet goes and the arrows go.
Okay, so it's kind of like in this view, like the judgments are presenting themselves before Christ, who is worthy, because he's the
Yeah.
one who mets out God's judgment. That's what it
Yes.
sounds like to me. Is that correct?
Yes. Because
Okay,
God is going to make everything bow to Jesus. That's what's happening throughout Revelations. So that by
interesting.
chapter
Okay,
19, everything is bowing, but it's God the Father who it's his decrees that are being released on behalf
okay.
of Jesus. And Jesus is sitting on his throne, watching it happen because he knows a kingdom will be given to him.
Now you still call yourself an historicist, correct? Like even though you're also a
Yes.
partial preterist, you're also an
So
historicist.
the word historicist is referring to the book of Revelations fulfilled throughout history, starting in the first century. So that's why I say first the Jews were judged, then the Roman Empire, then the rest of the world. That spreads out over at least 2,000 years. So I'm seeing the book of Revelations, chapter 4 to 19, started with John's lifetime. It continues in our time and into the future. It will continue up until Jesus comes back. His history is all written there. Historicist view.
Okay,
Yes.
in chapter 11, the seventh trumpet, is that the inauguration of the new covenant, or do you think that is this kind of jumping forward to the end of the age?
So I see the temple gets the first stone temple is there in verse 1, but then the temple is destroyed, and a new temple in verse 19, a new temple of God which is in heaven opened. So the new temple means to me there's a new high priest to administer the new covenant. I think the new covenant was made on the cross, but now there's the high priest to administer the new covenant.
Okay, okay,
70
and then
AD.
got it. Okay,
Yeah,
and then starting in chapter 13, that's when it
yes.
goes over into Rome.
Yes, that's what I understand, Rome.
And and this is where, like, I have questions for you too, actually.
Mhm.
Um, well, I guess, for the audience, one, so you see chapter 13 as a partial fulfillment with Nero in AD 70, but not a complete fulfillment?
Yeah, I believe Nero was in there, but it goes up until the Rome fell in 410, and then the Roman Empire, the western part of the Roman Empire, fell in 476. So I'm seeing that's what was prophesied in Daniel chapter 2. When the rock comes into the earth, it will destroy all of their kingdoms and it will destroy the Roman Empire. So, because that was prophesied, it has to be fulfilled. Once the rock, Jesus Christ, came into the earth, the kingdom will grow. And I believe it's the growth of Christianity displacing first the Jews, then the Roman Empire. And God is making this happen with judgment.
And so how does that overlap? But like in Revelation 11:7, it talks about the beast that that sends out of the bottomless pit. Then Revelation 13 talks about the beast. So
Yes.
how do those two overlap? Is it then the Antichrist, or I don't know if you would use a different term, or
Yeah.
just beast? Did
Beast.
it Okay, beast. Did it start then in the first century in your view, and then it just goes into the consummation when Christ returns?
The Roman Empire, I say, actually fell when the city of Rome was destroyed, and then the empire fell in 476. But then the third set of judgments goes on. And I think it's some of the same spirits that ruled in the Roman Empire are still some of the same spirits that are in the earth today. The spirits, like it talks about the harlot and the beast, I think he's talking about spirits behind the emperors, but the spirits that crave power, lust for finances, lust for wealth. I think those spirits are still in the earth, and they did seize the Roman leaders, but still in the earth. They're still deceiving other people, other nations. They're still at work. And Jesus literally has to have everything put under his feet. But it's some of the same spirits that are in the earth. So the Roman Empire fell, but the spirits that were making the Roman Empire evil still abide in the earth, still seeking people to devour, and they do seduce many leaders.
Okay, yeah, because I guess like that's the biggest question for me is like contextually, why do you see it that way? And this isn't like to
Yep.
to knock you, but like generally asking because like I want to learn. So
Yep.
like what is it contextually that has you view it? Like it sounds like kind of like an idealism to me.
Yes.
Like is that fair?
Yeah, it's fair.
Okay.
So, um, I could this. I think this helps. The Roman Catholic Church historically has believed that it's Jews first, then Romans, Roman Empire. But they have seen the second judgment as against the Roman Empire all the way up to chapter 19. Um, there has been disagreements among different leaders about perhaps it is only the Jews in the Roman Empire. I'm seeing the third set of judgments against the world, but I understand how they don't see that last part. Many of them only see the Jews in the Roman Empire. In fact, I believe that's the dominant view in historic Christianity. First set of judgment against Jews, second set against the Roman Empire. I'm, I have other people who believe like me, but
Yeah.
I believe I'm not giving the predominant view. The predominant view has been just Jews and Rome were judged. I'm going saying Jews, Rome, and the rest of the world before Jesus returns, because I'm seeing it's the spirits behind the Roman Empire that are continuing to work in the world, and they needed to be put to death.
Okay. Is what men in history like held this view with you?
So it's official Roman Catholic doctrine that it's Jews in Rome. That
Okay.
has been even before Augustine. It has been, and it's recently been repeated um, in Roman Catholicism as an official stance. Now, Protestants usually don't trust Catholics. Um, but I have some respect for the Catholic scholars. I'm not against them. Um, there was during the Protestant Reformation for about a 50-year period. Most of the leaders were historicists, but they picked out Babylon in the Book of Revelation as the Roman Catholic Church.
hmm
Most of our Protestant leaders said Babylon's the Catholic Church because they are very angry at the Catholic Church. I mean, even today, there's a lot of Christians who pick off Babylon as the organized church. They will say, oh, Babylon's the institutional church today.
Mm,
It's almost like anything you hate, you see it's being destroyed in Book of Revelation. So let's equate the two.
yeah.
There have always been leaders who have done that when they got angry, and still happening today. To me, it's not a scholarly, level headed view. And for that, the Catholics at times do demonstrate to me the most level headed view in some areas historically. I think they have the most level headed view on Jews than Rome. I don't think they were influenced as much uh, by the Protestant Reformation um, and some other difficulties that are going on today. Sometime people will put Muslims in there. They'll put the European Economic Union in there. They'll put the one world government in there. They're putting anything that they are suspicious of. Um, to me, it's
Got it.
just not a level headed scholarly view.
And then, so in chapter 15, where that goes into the end of the world, how does that
Yes.
work? Because like you see bold judgment, or bold
Yes.
judgments,
Yeah.
and then you see chapter 17, chapter 18, and then 19, 20. Like, how does that work with extending progressively?
Yes. So, and again, saying I extend it to the rest of the world because I'm seeing these as spirits behind powers on the earth are being judged. If you're just seeing this literally as Jerusalem is judged and then the city of Rome is judged, you're thinking physical entities on earth. Then it's hard to see chapters 15, 16, and 17 as continuing because you're thinking in terms of entities. I'm thinking of spiritual powers behind entities. So that's the view that allows me to see, looks to me like God's still working on those same beast and the same harlot that deceived the Roman Empire. So you have to make the shift if you're going to follow it to the whole world. You have to say, no, those are spiritual things rather than physical entities.
Okay. And then
But
with like things like the Euphrates drying up, with like, is that just like a spiritual significance, like God is always judging those spiritual beasts and I guess like spirit of deceptions throughout the world.
yeah, and I would think like first time back in chapter 9, it mentions the Euphrates. Well, here it's in verse 14. This is back with the Jews being judged. In chapter 9, verse 14, one
Mm,
saying to the sixth angel at a trumpet, release the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates.
mm.
Well, I'm going to look and see, is there anything that corresponds in the natural to that? Well, we know before the Jews were judged, there were four legions of the Roman army were at the Euphrates River. That's where they were commissioned from to go destroy Jerusalem. So I'm looking at, yes, there was a physical correspondence. Here it says four angels came from the Euphrates down to Jerusalem. I'm saying, yeah, that's the spiritual power. What does that mean in the natural? Well, I don't think it's any coincidence that four legions of armies, they came from the Euphrates to surround Jerusalem. So I'm always looking for that. Even Euphrates again. Yeah, I'm looking for a spiritual thing because John was in the spirit seeing spiritual things. Can we find natural correspondence? But we're doing our best. We might be making mistakes. I'm not claiming to have it perfectly accurate.
Yeah.
I'm trying to compare it to what have other, leaders believed in our history. I think I'm in the mainstream of the historic thought when I say Jews, then the Roman Empire, and a lot of them were the rest of the world, but a lot of them stopped with just Jews in the Roman Empire.
And then
So
so like, you would kind of like tie it in, I guess, to historical moments, but also there's still this extension of, because there's a spiritual reality behind it,
yes,
and that won't be
yes,
defeated until Christ comes.
yes.
Got it. Okay.
And
And
so
then I'm sorry, you can go
people
on.
don't need to understand it the way I understand it. You can take it more
Yeah.
literally as, buildings and cities. But I see it as spiritual powers behind those buildings and cities.
Okay. And then in chapter 17, when he talks about what verse is it? Where verse 10, where he talks about seven kings.
Yes.
Would you agree with like partial preterists like Kenneth Gentry and DeMar that those are the five empires and the six is Nero?
Yes, I would.
Okay.
Um, they just fit so nicely. um, but then again, I might say spiritual powers that were behind Nero are still at work in the world. The same powers that actually caused the Roman Empire to rise up were still at work in the world. So I just might make it spiritual powers rather than literally those human entities.
And then who would the seventh be then? Because even in I was recently thinking about this too, like even under Gary DeMar, Kenneth Gentry's view, where they talk
Yes.
about Nero's a six.
Yes.
So who is the seventh then in their view?
Well, there are seven Caesars, and they do put all seven Caesars. After Nero was Galba, um, and then we've got seven Caesars and 10 providences. They're referring to the 10 kings. There were 10 kings for much of the Western Roman Empire, 10 providences for most often. For a while it went to 12, a while it went down to 9, but for most of the time it was 10 providences. And I think DeMar agrees with that, but he's still taking it as literal. I'm looking at the spiritual powers behind the providences.
I guess I'm just wondering then what's the significance of the seventh? Because then he says the seventh is also the eighth, and that's that beast or the son of perdition. It seems like I
Yep.
don't know how how you tie it in and how they would tie that in.
So he would, I understand they would tie it in saying that literally seven Caesars were there and they were possessed. That Satan cast out of heaven is now wandering the earth. And when Jesus ascended in heaven, Satan was cast out of heaven. Doesn't mean he's off the earth. He's wandering there seeking someone to devour. I think Nero became possessed. I think Galba and Caligula all became possessed. I think they were literally so evil that their thoughts were consumed. So I understand that they equate him with the seven Caesars. I'm equating it with the seven spirits behind the seven Caesars.
Okay, gotcha. And then in what way, because reading on the chapter 17,
Yep.
the 10 kings, Christ through judgment uses them to destroy the harlot, religion.
Yes.
So how do you see that fulfilled?
So I'm not quite convinced the harlot's religion.
Okay.
So it says they commit acts of adultery with her. Um, and it's definitely something kings fall in love with. I think there are also other things that kings can get seduced by, like wealth, sexual perversions, greed, power. I think it can be all or any of those. But yes, religion you can also get seduced by. But I'm a little critical of them just saying it's religion because they want to work the Jews in there. They want to equate the harlot with Israel. Um, I'm not as anti-Jewish as they come out being.
Mm,
They're putting all these judgments, second set of judgments, first set, second set, and third set as against the Jews, not against the Roman Empire. They have three sets of judgments against the Jews. It does produce a more critical view of the Jewish people than the way I'm looking at it. Um, and I don't see how they can call one of the big reasons that they can do that is because in Revelations chapter 11, verse 8, it says, "And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city." Okay, we know chapter 11 is about Jerusalem. The rest of the verse says, "Where also their Lord was crucified." The great city is where our Lord is crucified. Well, the great city is continued to talk about in chapters 17 and 18, the great city. They equate it. That's where they get the connection between Jerusalem in chapter 11 is called the great city, but the great city, Babylon, it's called the great city. So also is the great city in chapter 17, 18 called the great city. That's how they connect. It's all the same. I have a hard time with that because when great city is used in chapter 11, it's male in gender. Both the word great and city are male.
hmm.
When Babylon or the great city in chapters all the way 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18, it's female. Both the word great and city. They ignore that. To me, that's very significant in Greek writing. They called Jerusalem male gender. They called this other city female gender. I have to say they're two different cities. They equate the two. By equating the two, they're taking all the judgments toward Jerusalem and the Jews. I say, no, look, one's male, the other's female. They would point out that where it says a city with seven mountains around it, they try to convince us that there's seven mountains around Jerusalem. I don't buy that. Rome was known in history. There are many writings referring to it as the city of seven hills. We have coins that still say Rome coin, city of seven hills. I cannot equate it. No, the second city is a great city. It's a different city than the one destroyed in chapter 11. So that's where I disagree with them. They have
Yeah,
separated two
got it.
cities. I say they're two separate cities.
And then when you see Revelation where the destruction of Babylon, is that
Yes.
future when Christ finally, or right before he comes?
So I would say there's a spirit behind Babylon, and it was defeated when Rome was defeated.
Hmm.
It fell back then, but that spirit remains in the earth. It can still seduce people. The harlot still is seducing. And in particular, leaders, governmental leaders, have a especially dangerous position. They're more vulnerable than the average human being. There is something at work in the earth that tries to deceive leaders because it can control large parts of the world if it can get their hearts. So I see the harlot as it seduces, but it's not religion because they're making it religion so they can equate it with the Jewish religion. I'm saying, no, it's something seducing leaders, and it can be other things also.
Because one of the things that I've been learning with classical historicists is that they
Yes.
held that the 10 provinces were, after Rome fell, pagan Rome, and then 10 provinces came out of it, and then from that, the Catholic Church, which they think is the Antichrist,
Yes.
sprung up. So under this view, those 10 kings, they hate the harlot. Was that fulfilled when pagan Rome fell, in your view, and then the spiritual reality behind it? They're still roaming the earth.
So I still, again, have to think in terms of spirits. Like, I think there was a spirit that caused Rome to set up an empire like a pyramid with an emperor at the top. I think the desire for power causes you to make things so you can rule and you can control. Now, city of Rome's destroyed in 410. The government of Rome scattered. They were killed or they left the city. There was nothing left. But the religious leaders in Rome continued. They were the only group in the city of Rome that had enough cohesiveness where they filled the void. That's when they stepped into, in the year 410, they stepped into their rulership position. Now, I think the spirit is still around that caused the Roman Empire to make a pyramid, I think, and then control. It doesn't mean the next people have to fall for that spirit, but I think that spirit is going to try get the next people in line. So I don't like to make blanket statements about the Roman Catholic Church. I have suspicions about when the church and the Pope declared he's the vicar of Christ.
Hmm.
I have suspicions about, is that the same spirit that was on Rome that
Yeah.
is touching? Okay. So I'm talking not in definitive terms. I'm not quite as critical of the Catholic Church of saying it is it. I'm saying there are spirits that are trying to get at leaders, and they probably did. There were times when the Roman Catholic Church reached real corruption, real drive for wealth and greed. There were times, but the Catholic Church hasn't always been that way. There's also been seasons when the Catholic Church, it was the voice for Christianity throughout the Middle Ages. I still think of the Catholic Church as our mother and the Protestants as our father. I don't think it's totally evil. So I'm seeing these spirits, but I'm stepping back from total condemnation. I'm not there with a lot of the other people who use revelations to condemn the Catholic Church. I simply think there's spirits at work. And if they can't get leaders in the Catholic Church, they'll get somebody else. They will continue to try to deceive. I think kings have been seduced by him. I think, you know, wealthy people, head of corporations, can get seduced by him. I think they're wandering the earth, and um, I think that's
Got it.
what God's trying to
Yeah.
kill. God's
Hmm.
trying to destroy them, not physical entities, but spiritual entities.
Interesting. Okay. Well, let's get down to the meat and potatoes now.
Okay. Well, there we
An hour
go.
and 15-minute in, right?
Okay.
Doesn't have to take too long, this end, but because when people hear this, they might think premillennialism again is associated with dispensationalism.
Yes.
And
Yes.
one of the things that I have seen by reading various theologians and
Yeah.
even the Protestant era is that premillennialism is not tied to a view of Revelation. Like you can go down your view, the historicist view, the
Yes.
futurist view, and the idealist view. And even
Yes.
for me too, what I recognize is that like I've changed my views on certain things,
Yeah.
but my eschatology or my millennialism has not changed. I'm still a firm premillennialist. So can
Yes.
you explain why why are you, after all this, still a premillennialist?
Okay. So I still think that this book was written chronologically. I think the three sets of judgments came chronologically. First the Jews, then the Rome, then the rest of the world. I see the whole book chronologically, therefore. Um, I see that when Jesus appeared to John way back in chapters 1, and then also in chapter 4, when he talks to him, contrary to what DeMar and those who agree with him say, they say Jesus told them that these things will soon be fulfilled. Okay. No, they're misquoting that. It doesn't say they'll be fulfilled. It says these things will take place and it's an ongoing take place.
Mm,
That Jesus was going to tell them this is what will start now, begin now, but not fulfilled. Fulfilled is not in there. They always misquote what Jesus said.
great point.
When you say fulfilled, that backs up their thinking that all of Revelations is fulfilled. Okay. But you can tell where people are biasing thing by where they misquote scripture. Uh, I always look for that because you can usually identify their bias toward it. And Jesus told John, write the things that will take place, that have place, are going to take place, and even a will take place. It's an ongoing thing. So because of that, I don't take it as an accomplished book of Revelations done. I see it as an ongoing fulfilled. After the three judgments, Jesus comes back in chapter 19. It looks to me, chapter 20, there's a millennial reign, 1,000 years. I take it as it is.
Oh, you
It
do
is.
take 19 as the second coming.
Yeah, I take 19
Okay,
as.
me too.
Yeah, okay. And it doesn't say it exactly. It just says he appears and the war's done. The war's done definitely by chapter 19. He appears in total victory. It
Yeah.
doesn't say he's back of the earth, but it says he's now going to rule the nations with a rod of iron, which to me, he's taking a position now and starting to reign.
Yeah, he's
So,
striking down the nations. He's defeating the false prophet and beast.
yeah, it's all done. All those
Yeah.
things are finally defeated. So, chapter 20, to me, it's because I'm chronologically reading. I believe after chapter 20, there's a great white throne judgment, then a new heavens and an earth. I accept it all chronologically in order. I'm not rearranging any of it, where people do have to rearrange it. If you're not a premillennialist, you have to rearrange this. You're
Yeah,
not
you have to make
accepting it.
something happen, or you got to recapitulate chapter 20 like the millennialist.
And to me, that's rearranging it.
Yeah.
That's that's taking chapter 20 and arranging it before chapter 4, 3, because it's stretching it out over all of history. Um,
and
so
and
to
and
me,
even the classical historicists, and this is
yes.
what I like to point out too to new, I call them neo post mills, that
Okay.
even they agree with the premillennialists that this was future. This was not like an amillennialist where it's like kind of now and then it just goes into the consummation right when Christ comes.
Yes. Yes. So to me, the reason I believe premillennial is because I believe this is what it says. This is how it's written.
Is it just because, like, are there other passages in the Bible besides Revelation 19 and 20 that makes you a pre-mill? Like, is there anything else? Because I know people
Nothing
won't like that.
yeah, nothing
They'll say, oh,
convincing.
you're a one text premillennialist.
Right. There's nothing convincing to me. But the word premillennial is, I mean, not premillennial, but millennium is 6 times in this one chapter. So people say, well, it's only one time. Well, no, it's 6 times in one chapter. Um, but, there's descriptions of a kingdom reign when peace is there and people beat their swords into plowshares. I put those in here, but it, that's my choice. I'm doing that because it fits how I see it happening. The only convincing thing for me is Revelations 20.
Okay. And just to get really technical, I know you hold to an early date of Revelation. Like, do you think like
Yes.
66 AD or or do you think like a little bit before that?
So I'm not exactly sure. It has to be before 70 AD because the temple was still standing. Um, most partial preterists and full preterists say 56 or 57. Um, I'm convinced it was during Nero's reign because we have two writings that say John was cast on the island of Patmos on Nero's reign. So he reigned from 54 to 68. So to me, it could be anywhere within there. Those are the only two historic documents that date it for me.
Okay. And then one last question, and maybe this is a bonus question for for the audience. The son of Second Thessalonians chapter 2, the son of perdition, or the man of
Yes.
lawlessness, I should say.
Yeah.
What's your view on that? Do you think that's Nero? Do you think that's somebody else?
So I write it in the book, that three different possible explanations, and I try not to take anything definitive. But what I do point out is that there's three references here to it being alive during the time of the writer of Second Thessalonians. He says, for example, I'm open to Second Thessalonians chapter 2. It says in verse 6, and you will know that what restrains him now, so that's a now tense, so that in his time he will be revealed, for the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. So there's a second reference that it was active then, only he now restrains him, now restrains. So there's three references saying it was alive and active during the first century. So I don't think there's enough information to be definitive about it. Nero's my best guess, but there were so many leaders. It could have been a local leader in Thessalonica. This is a letter written to a city. There's no other reference anywhere in the Bible that definitely associates with this. So it's certainly possible it was just a local leader also. But Nero is my best choice, looking for something that was in existence now, 2,000 years ago.
Gotcha. Well, thank you very, very much for dealing with all my questions and everything. As you can tell, I just wanted to pick your brain a little bit because I really did enjoy your book. Like, your book is very easy to read, and I
Yeah,
appreciate that.
thank
And it was just fun to read, honestly. Even now, like kind of just want to read it again. I know, what is it? You have another book on partial preterism, I
you.
guess
Yeah,
refuting hyper, if I'm not mistaken.
yeah. So I did a follow-up book, The
There it is.
Comings of
Okay.
Christ, because I get accused of being a full preterist, because futurists have never heard of this position that some of the prophecies have been fulfilled. So they immediately go to the extreme. Oh, we've heard about you guys. You're full preterist. So the second book is simply explaining why I'm not a full preterist, why I only believe part of the prophecies are fulfilled, and there's still some that have to be fulfilled. Most
Okay.
importantly, there's a second coming in the future.
Great, and yeah, and that's important because hyperpreterism is online
Yes,
is on the rise a little bit,
it
and so it's
is.
important that we maintain that distinction. Christ is still to come physically, bodily, raise the saints physically, bodily as well.
Yes.
Yeah,
I'm
so yeah,
sold on that.
yeah, me
Yeah.
too.
Yes.
Um, I'll leave both your books in the description. Do you want to leave our audience with final words and if you want to go into the victorious part of eschatology?
Sure. That's the most important thing. All these details that you and I have been talking about what is this verse? How do you interpret this verse? They're interesting. And especially if you're a Bible teacher, you should take time to learn the different positions. But to me, the average Christian, what I really wish they would catch is simply the message that 2,000 years ago, Jesus sat on a throne. He's been ruling ever since, and the kingdom is growing ever since. Most of his parables talk about the kingdom of heaven is like seeds growing. It's like yeast growing in dough. It's like the smallest of all seed. Simply the promise that the kingdom is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. That's victorious. You have to have an optimistic view. That means Satan is not God of this world. Dispensationalism teaches Satan is God of this world. The victorious view says, no, Jesus Christ is Lord. Satan has been dethroned. He's still active wandering the earth, but he's no longer ruling over the earth. Jesus Christ is Lord. He is the only ruler of the earth now. So that victorious element is the most important part that I wish every Christian would get. All the rest is details.
Amen. Well, thank you very, very much, for coming on. And viewers, I hope you enjoyed this talk. Please like and share. It helps the algorithm get out. And if you haven't subscribed, and we're also on Apple and Spotify. Until next time, take care and God bless.